10 minutes before I walked into my sister's wedding ballroom, I swore I'd keep it civil and leave. 10 minutes after I stepped through the doors, I knew that plan had ended right where I stood. Because the faces turning toward me, my mother, my father, my sister Martha, weren't just surprised. They were afraid, and they should have been. After all the lies they told about me, after everything they'd taken, they had good reason to believe I'd never return to this city, to this life, to them. But here I was, standing in the crystal-lit ballroom of Washington's most expensive hotel, watching the decade of lies they draped over my name begin to crumble like dry paper. Nobody recognized me at first. Not the aunt who used to pinch my cheeks and call me her little angel, not the family friends who lent my parents the money to start their dental practice 3 decades ago. I crossed the threshold with a mild smile, my teal silk dress modest enough to blend but sharp enough to cut if the circumstances required it. My husband Ethan walked beside me with the steady confidence of a man who had never been thrown out of his own home. It was the music that hit me harder than expected, the same old Celtic melody my grandmother used to hum while she baked bread in the kitchen. Martha had chosen this tune, of course, to bind herself to traditions, to the roots she had done nothing to earn besides being born into them. My chest tightened against a swelling rage that I'd been armored against for years. I wouldn't give her a scene. I wouldn't give them anything. Ethan whispered that he wanted to find some water, and I nodded, letting him slip through the crowd. I left myself standing alone for a moment near the long camelot table with its elegant arrangement of roses and white lilies. My mother emerged first from the cluster near the altar, her face flushing rosy pink when her eyes met mine. Her mouth formed a noiseless, oh, that sounded more like a choke. I watched her wait for a response that I didn't give her. She approached slowly, her champagne flute tight in clenched fingers, her eyes darting toward the doors behind me as if she were calculating how quickly she could have me forcibly removed. "Claire," she breathed in an unsteady voice full of shock disguised as warmth. "I didn't know, we didn't expect you to come to the wedding." Her words faltered like a child caught lying about breakfast money. I'd give her that she looked older, more tired than I remembered. Her makeup clung to her face in uneven patches, the wrinkles along her mouth more pronounced than necessary for someone who lived such a fine life. I was invited. I replied simply, my tone neither warm nor hostile, just acknowledgement. Ethan and I were guests on the list. Mary Cassidy sent us invitations. I drew out the memorial card bearing the embossed bride and groom's names. My mother's face dropped another shade. Mary Cassidy was Martha's college roommate and never did understand why the Collins family stopped mentioning their eldest daughter after she graduated high school. Martha appeared next, gliding through the sea of guests, her lace gown swept in a delicate train that trailed behind her like the false promises she'd scattered. Her eyes snapped onto me with disbelief, then flared wide with something sharper lying beneath. Panic, maybe guilt, maybe rage at my audacity to exist in her perfect moment. "You can't be here," she started to say, but her voice broke mid-sentence when Ethan returned to my side, placing a glass of water in my hand with deliberate care. His presence, tall and composed in his tailored suit, reminded everyone watching that I hadn't come alone or unprepared. Martha's new husband, James, according to the embossed invitations, appeared at her elbow, confusion creasing his features. He looked between us, trying to map the connection, the tension crackling like static electricity between two people who should share warmth but only traded coldness. My father materialized from somewhere deeper in the crowd, his jaw set in the familiar line of authority he always wielded when I was young and easier to intimidate. He positioned himself between Martha and me like a human shield, his shoulders squared as if preparing for combat. His voice came low and harsh when he spoke, telling me I needed to leave, that I was ruining everything, that I had no right to be here after what I'd done. What I'd done. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, visible to everyone watching this family drama unfold. I let the silence stretch, let the guests lean closer to hear what scandal would spill next. Then I spoke, voice calm and clear enough to carry across the hushed ballroom. "I haven't done anything except survive what you did to me." The silence that followed my words felt like glass shattering in slow motion. Guests shifted uncomfortably, champagne glasses frozen halfway to lips, eyes darting between my family and me as if watching a car accident unfold. My father's face darkened to a dangerous shade of red, the kind that used to send me running to my room when I was 12. But I wasn't 12 anymore, and running had stopped being my response years ago. James stepped forward, his confusion deepening into something sharper. He looked at Martha, then at my parents, then back to me, clearly trying to piece together a puzzle he hadn't known existed until this moment. Martha reached for his arm, her fingers clutching at his sleeve with desperate urgency, but he pulled away gently, his attention now fully on the drama unfolding before him. My mother attempted damage control, her voice pitched to carry across the crowd with forced cheerfulness. She announced that I'd always been dramatic, that family disagreements happened in every household, that this was hardly the time or place for such discussions. But her words sounded hollow even to her own ears, the practiced social mask slipping to reveal panic underneath. Ethan's hand found mine, his touch steady and grounding. He'd heard the full story years ago, sitting across from me in a hospital break room at 3 a.m, listening as I finally broke down and told him everything. How they'd taken my college fund, the money my grandmother had left specifically for me, and transferred it to Martha's account. How, when I confronted them, my father had called me selfish and ungrateful. How my mother had stood silent while he told me that if I couldn't accept their decision, I wasn't welcome in their home anymore. I was 18 and had nowhere to go. Martha had been 15, watching from a staircase, saying nothing. Now she stood in her $1,000 wedding gown, her perfect makeup beginning to crack at the corners, and I watched her realize that the foundation she'd built her life on was crumbling. James turned to her fully, his voice low but audible to those nearby, asking if what I'd said was true. Martha's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air, no words forming, no denials coming. My father tried to redirect, insisting loudly that I'd always twisted facts to suit my narrative, that I'd dropped out of college on my own accord, that they'd offered support but I'd rejected it out of spite. The lies came so smoothly, I almost admired the performance. Almost. But several guests exchanged glances now, skepticism blooming across their faces as they watched a man protest too much. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for without knowing I was waiting. A woman in a navy dress, someone I vaguely recognized from my parents' old circle, spoke up from the crowd. She mentioned that she remembered when I'd won that full academic scholarship to State University, how impressive it had been for someone working multiple jobs. How my grandmother would have been so proud. The statement landed like a bomb. My father's narrative shattered against the truth spoken by a neutral witness. Martha's face drained of color as James stepped back from her, his expression shifting from confusion to betrayal. He asked her directly if she'd known about this, if she'd known her college education had been funded by stealing from her sister. Martha finally found her voice, but it came out thin and reedy, nothing like the confident tone she'd used all evening. She claimed it hadn't been stealing, that the money had stayed in the family, that their parents had made a financial decision they thought was best. But even as she spoke, I could see her realizing how weak the justification sounded, how it confirmed everything I'd implied without needing me to say another word. I didn't need to destroy them. They were doing it themselves, in front of everyone who mattered to them, at the event they'd spent months planning to be perfect. The truth had always been there, waiting patiently for its moment. All I'd done was show up and let it breathe. I excused myself from the ballroom 20 minutes later, leaving Ethan to handle the curious questions from guests who'd witnessed the confrontation. My heels clicked against the marble floor as I made my way to the hotel's business center, a quiet sanctuary where clarity could replace the chaos swirling in my chest. The confrontation had been accidental, unplanned, but now that the truth had cracked open, I needed to decide what came next. Sitting in front of a computer terminal, I pulled up the files I'd kept for years, stored in cloud folders I'd told myself I'd never need to access. Bank statements from when I was 18, showing the sudden transfer of funds from my grandmother's trust. Email exchanges between my parents and the university discussing tuition payments that had been redirected. Screenshots of text messages Martha had sent me the night I was thrown out, Messages that ranged from apologetic to coldly practical, telling me I'd understand someday why they'd made this choice. I hadn't kept these documents out of spite or some fantasy of revenge. I'd kept them because part of me had needed proof that my memory wasn't faulty, that what happened had been real and not some distortion of a difficult family moment. Now, staring at the evidence spread across the screen, I realized they served a different purpose entirely. My phone buzzed with a text from Ethan asking if I was all right. I responded that I needed a few more minutes, that I was thinking through something important. He understood without needing further explanation. He always did. The question wasn't whether I could destroy my family's reputation. I clearly could. The documentation alone would be enough to expose years of manipulation and financial impropriety. Martha's entire identity was built on credentials she hadn't earned, opportunities she'd taken from me without remorse. My parents had committed what amounted to theft, justifying it with some twisted logic about family priorities and hard decisions. But revenge wasn't what I wanted. I'd spent 10 years building a life that had nothing to do with them, creating success on my own terms, and dragging myself through their mess again felt like stepping backward into quicksand. What I wanted was something cleaner, more permanent. I wanted them to face consequences not because I'd orchestrated their downfall, but because the truth simply existed and couldn't be ignored anymore. An idea began forming, cold and precise. I wouldn't need to destroy them publicly or create some dramatic expose. I would simply ensure that the people who mattered, James, their professional circles, the institutions they relied on for credibility, had access to information they could verify independently. No accusations from a bitter daughter, no family drama played out in court. Just facts, quietly delivered to those who had the authority and motivation to act on them. I drafted an email to James's personal account, attaching copies of the trust documents and bank transfers, along with a brief note explaining that he deserved to know the full truth before making permanent decisions about his future. I added Martha's old messages for context, the ones where she'd acknowledged what our parents had done but insisted it was for the best. Then I composed a second message to the ethics board at the dental association my parents belonged to, outlining concerns about financial practices at their clinic. I didn't make accusations. I simply asked questions about proper handling of family trusts and conflicts of interest when family members worked together in medical practices. I didn't send either message immediately. Instead, I saved them as drafts, giving myself time to consider whether this was truly the path I wanted to take. The power sat there in my inbox, waiting, patient as I'd been for the last decade. Ethan found me 30 minutes later, standing by the window overlooking the city lights. He didn't ask what I decided, just stood beside me in comfortable silence until I was ready to speak. I told him I'd made my choice, that I knew exactly what needed to happen next, and that when morning came, everything would shift in ways my family couldn't control or manipulate. He nodded, trusting my judgment the way he always had, and together we walked back toward our future, leaving my past to finally face its reckoning. The messages sat in my inbox overnight, waiting for a final surge of conviction. I woke before sunrise, the city still veiled in quiet, my mind sharp and clear. No one in my family would expect me to act, especially not now, after so many years spent in exile. But that was the irony. They underestimated what survival had taught me. I sent the emails before breakfast. One to James, the man who deserved truth more than anyone else in Martha's circle, who might use it not for punishment, but for clarity about the promises made to him. The second went to the ethics board, containing only facts and not the emotional backstory, the kind of evidence that required action from those invested in public trust. It felt oddly anticlimactic, the click of a mouse rather than a dramatic confrontation, but there was relief baked into the simplicity. The story had been released from the confines of my own memory. The fallout started in invisible ripples. I didn't witness James's reaction firsthand, but Ethan did. He'd lingered near the groom during the morning's brunch. James, newly armed with copies of old bank transfers and trust documents, withdrew from Martha quietly. By noon, he'd confronted her away from the crowd, demanding honesty and refusing further conversation without answers. I learned all this not through direct words but hinted explanations, Ethan recounting overheard fragments, My mother's anxious phone calls soon filling my voicemail with pleas for silence, Martha's text swinging from apology to accusation. It moved quickly. By the end of the weekend, Martha's reputation among her friends and professional contacts had changed. People spoke less to her in public. Newspaper articles about the Collins family dental practice darkened with speculation, the ethics board launching a formal review of their records. My parents called again, desperate to spin the story. A misunderstanding, a clerical error. Their voices sounded smaller than I recalled, as if the weight of truth had compressed them to manageable size. I did not respond. James sent one message, a brief thank you, no attachments, no emotional outpourings. He understood, as I had, that living one's life was not about destroying others, but about refusing to carry their damage any further. Within weeks, the story had grown beyond my family's control. Guests at the wedding whispered about scandals. Martha's college credentials were quietly reconsidered by her employer, and the Collins dental practice lost clients who valued transparency. Some family friends reached out to me, offering support, recalling moments from my childhood I'd forgotten. The shift was gradual, but unmistakable. My parents, who'd built their legacy on the myth of self-sacrifice, now found themselves left with only the truth they'd tried to bury. The most telling change came from Martha herself. She sent a single message, not a plea, not a threat, but an acknowledgement. She said she never understood how far a lie could crawl, how deeply it eroded trust. She did not ask for forgiveness, knowing there were lines she couldn't cross back over. I did not answer, but I felt a cold kind of respect for her honesty at last. Publicly, there was no drama. No viral videos, no speeches or confrontations. But the consequences were visible in all the spaces my family used to fill. Their practice dimmed, their social invitations dwindled, and their reputation in the professional world lessened with each new revelation. It was not destruction. It was simply clarity. Everyone now saw what had been hidden. I found unexpected comfort in how ordinary life remained. My work continued. Ethan waited at home. Friends invited us for dinner, and the city itself carried on regardless. The family who once made me feel invisible had become invisible themselves, not through rage or spectacle, but through the simple power of truth left standing. No revenge was needed. The world itself had adjusted, and my own place within it grew stronger every day. 3 months passed before I understood what freedom actually felt like. It wasn't the rush of vindication or the satisfaction of watching consequences unfold. It was quieter than that. A Tuesday morning making coffee in my kitchen, sunlight slanting through the window, and realizing I hadn't thought about my family in days. The calls had stopped. Martha's texts no longer filled my phone with frantic justifications or bitter accusations. My parents had retreated into whatever remained of their practice, managing the fallout privately. James had filed for annulment, citing fraud as grounds, and moved to a different city where his career could restart without the shadow of scandal. I learned these details not through direct contact, but through the occasional update from mutual acquaintances who felt I deserved to know. I didn't seek out information about them. There was no satisfaction in tracking their decline, no pleasure in knowing their reputations had crumbled. What mattered was that the weight I'd carried for a decade had finally lifted, not because they'd apologized or made amends, but because I'd stopped waiting for either. Ethan noticed the change before I did. He mentioned one evening that I smiled more easily now, that the tension I used to carry in my shoulders had dissolved. We were sitting on our small balcony, watching the city lights flicker on as dusk settled, and his observation struck me as profoundly true. I had been holding my breath for years, braced against the next wound, and only now had I learned to exhale. Work continued, as it always had. My career, built independently of my family's influence or support, remained steady and fulfilling. Colleagues respected my expertise, clients valued my judgment, and nothing about my professional identity had been tainted by the revelations about my family. If anything, the distance between us had become clearer. They were their own people with their own consequences, and I was mine. I received one final message from Martha 6 weeks after the wedding. It wasn't an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement that she understood now what she hadn't grasped before, that taking something from someone doesn't just hurt them, it damages you too. She said she was working to rebuild her life honestly, starting from scratch in ways she'd never had to before. I read the message once, then archived it without responding. There was nothing left to say between us. My grandmother's jewelry box sat on my dresser, the one thing I'd taken when I left home all those years ago. Inside were a few pieces she'd left me: a simple silver bracelet, a pair of pearl earrings, a locket with her photograph. I wore the bracelet sometimes, not as a reminder of what was stolen, but as evidence of what remained. Some legacies couldn't be taken, only carried forward by those who valued them. The strangest gift came from an unexpected source. One of my parents' former friends reached out, someone I barely remembered from childhood gatherings. She explained that she'd always suspected something wasn't right about how they spoke of me, how quickly I'd disappeared from family stories. She said she wished she'd asked questions back then, wished she'd done more. I thanked her for the honesty, though I explained I didn't need retroactive advocacy. The past was finished, and I'd already moved beyond it. Evenings settled fully now, the city glowing beneath us. Ethan refilled my glass of wine, asked if I was hungry yet, mentioned he'd made reservations for later in the week. The ordinariness of it all felt like the deepest victory, that my life could be simple and good without needing drama or resolution from people who'd already taken enough. I didn't forgive them. Forgiveness wasn't required for peace. What I'd learned instead was that freedom didn't come from their acknowledgement or their suffering. It came from recognizing I'd built something real without them, that my worth had never depended on their validation, and that walking away from their chaos was the most powerful choice I'd ever made.